All
Do you
right.
like my new haircut?
I do. It looks like you're ready for spring. Now maybe the weather will comply and become nice. But I'm not so sure.
You know what?
I'm
You know that
playing lacrosse, so I'm gonna be running around a
April
lot.
showers bring May flowers.
That's true. April showers bring May flowers. There you go. All right, my friends, welcome. It is Wednesday, April 5th. We are going to do the second of our social studies lessons. And before we get started, I want to ask you a really big question. So yesterday we were talking about or not yesterday, but Monday and Tuesday, we were talking about the first people who came to the North American continent and sort of wondering how they got here. Did they come by land? Did they come in kayaks in the water? And that's interesting. And then we found out that those people spread and covered all of North and South America and lived here for up to 15,000 years before any other people came to this area. But then a time came when other people did come to this area. And you know, today, the people who live in our country. And so as you think about history and why certain groups of people, humankind, human beings, humanoid people, evolved from sort of more like apes in Africa originally. And then the first people were in Africa and they spread from there to the rest of the world. And we have very ancient and very developed cultures all over the world. So why did the people who live here now end up being the ones who sort of like won and took over this land? Why did that happen? Why did one group end up being, I don't want to use the word superior, but more powerful than other groups? What were the things that people discovered that gave them an advantage over other people when people started traveling around and trying to take over each other's areas? Does anybody know?
Weapons.
Weapons are one of them. Yep.
And animals.
The different animals is actually a huge thing. Places that had large animals, places that didn't. Like, I don't know if you know this, but part of Africa has a fly that if it bites the cattle there, they die. And so when I lived in Africa, the part of Africa I lived in had no large animals. I know you think about Africa as having like elephants and giraffes, but those are not all over Africa. Africa is huge. It's many, many countries. My part of Africa, about the most exciting animal I saw was a chicken. I lived in Africa for 2 years. I didn't see any elephants, no tigers, no lions, no bears. Oh my. Anyway, as you think about that, there have been a lot of people who've spent a lot of time trying to ask themselves that exact question. What is it that made one group take over another group? What is it in the evolution of history that made things go a certain way? So as we start to look at history, it's a really complex, really big thing when you're talking about 15,000 years, right? So as we start to look at that, you want to ask yourself those big questions like, who were the big groups of population? Where did they live? Which groups developed in which ways, in which areas? Did they get gunpowder in this part of the world first or in China? Does anybody know that? China got it first. So the Chinese had a really advanced society really early on. We're going to kind of start looking at that today. So our first question that we looked at was like, who came to North America first? Our second question is then, after those 15,000 years and all these developed groups, some other people came over and really caused quite a lot of trouble. So let's take a look at the troublemakers. When did they come? Why did they come? And how is it that they ended up dominating other people? I'm going to share my screen. We've got a slideshow to go through today. We've got a couple of videos to watch. And if you join me today, then all you have to do is submit something saying, oh, I just shared that to breakout rooms, which is weird. I didn't mean to do that. But nobody's in the breakout rooms and I'll close them. So then that won't be an issue. Uh-oh, there we go. Okay, that was weird. Participants using older Zoom versions in breakout rooms cannot hear the shared sound. Okay, that's weird. I'm getting strange messages. So as you look on your calendar for today, here we are on Wednesday the 5th. Click on that. You'll see down here that it says Zoom to content lesson. If you attend the lesson live, you only have to submit something saying you were there. If you miss, you'll need to go find the recording, watch it, and then submit writing according to the directions. So here's the activity. Activity 2, exploration and colonization. You will find this in social studies. I should have listed that, but I didn't. Sorry. It says your submission is due tomorrow. Here is our slide deck that we're going to watch. Okay, and actually I'm going to close it because I have it open already. Oh, no, here. Okay. Exploration and colonization. It says follow along in your notes, so you can take notes if you want to, but you don't have to. We've already talked a little bit this year and studied a little bit this year about explorers. So we're going to go kind of quickly through this first part because I think it's a lot of repetition. So remember, millions of diverse indigenous means the first people in that land. Indigenous people were already connected to each other through family, trade, networks, language, and war. And here is the dominant economic activity. Here's the United States and Canada and Alaska and Mexico, which is part of North America. And you can see that the green part, they were mostly hunting. The purple part, they were doing agriculture. The red part is hunter-gatherer. Those are kind of deserts, actually. And then the blue part is fishing. Where we lived was considered a very wealthy area for the native people. It was quite an easy place to live, partially because of that kelp highway we saw. So after that, after the 15,000 years, these guys over in Europe started to get ideas. So here they are in Europe, and it's getting really crowded because, to tell you the truth, Europe is really tiny. I'm sure you've heard a lot about countries like England and France. And even though England had a lot of power, it is a tiny little country. If you look at it, this little tiny bit of land is all it is. So we've kind of looked at some of these routes that the early explorers took. And you can see that they've kind of color-coded them: the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish. So what do you notice? What do you wonder about those explorations? You can see that they came from Europe directly across the Atlantic Ocean to the east coast of the United States. So we're on the west coast, so we're way over here, and you can see there wasn't as much exploration there because a little tiny thing stood in the way, the giant continents of North and South America, and the only way around was to go north of it, but it got awfully icy up there, or to go way south around the tip of South America. So one of the things we talked about is how some of the earliest people to explore the oceans were the Polynesians. So these are the people who were in the islands, and we're going to watch a little TED Talk on them.
Imagine setting sail from Hawaii in a canoe. Your target is a small island thousands of kilometers away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's a body of water that covers more than 160 million square kilometers, greater than all the land masses on Earth combined. For thousands of years, Polynesian navigators managed voyages like this without the help of modern navigational aids. Ancient Polynesians used the sun, moon, stars, planets, ocean currents, and clouds as guides that allowed them to see the ocean as a series of pathways rather than an obstacle. Their voyages began around 1500 BC, when the people who would settle Polynesia first set sail from Southeast Asia. Early Polynesians eventually settled a vast area of islands spread over 40 million square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean. Some historians believe the voyagers moved from place to place to avoid overpopulation, others that they were driven by war. Voyages became less frequent by around 1300 AD, as Polynesian societies became more rooted in specific locations. During the voyaging period, successful journeys depended on a number of factors: well-built canoes, the skill of navigators, and weather being some of the biggest. Voyages relied on sturdy va'akalua, or double-hulled canoes, which were powered by sails and steered with a single large oar. Canoe building involved the whole community, bringing together the navigators, canoe builders, priests, chanters, and hula dancers. Navigators were keen observers of the natural world. They were abundantly familiar with trade-wind-generated ocean swells, which typically flow northeast or southeast. By day, navigators could identify direction by the rocking motion of their canoes caused by these swells. But sunrise and sunset were even more useful. The sun's position indicated east and west and created low light on the ocean that made it possible to see swells directly. At night, navigators used something called a star compass, which wasn't a physical object, but rather a sort of mental map. They memorized the rising and setting points of stars and constellations at different times of the year. They used those to divide the sky into 4 quadrants, subdivided into 32 houses, with the canoe in the middle. So, for example, when they saw the star Pura Atea rising from the ocean, they knew that to be northeast. They had some other tricks too. The Earth's axis points towards Hokupa'a, or the North Star, so called because it's the one fixed point in the sky as the Earth rotates, and always indicates north. However, it's not visible south of the equator, so navigators there could use a constellation called Neve, or the Southern Cross, and some mental tricks to estimate where south is. For instance, draw a line through these 2 stars, extend it 4.5 times, and draw another line from there to the horizon. That's south. But the sky also contains navigational aids much closer to Earth, the clouds. Besides being useful weather cues, under the right conditions, they can indicate land masses. For instance, the lagoons of Pacific atolls can actually be seen reflected on the underside of clouds, if you know what to look for. And high masses of clouds can indicate mountainous islands. Once navigators neared their destination, other clues such as the flight patterns of birds, floating debris or vegetation, and types of fish in the area helped determine the proximity of land. For example, the Manuoku had a known flight range of 190 kilometers and could be followed back to shore. So how do we know all of this? Partially through evidence in petroglyphs, written observations of European explorers, and Polynesian oral traditions, but also by trying them out for ourselves. In 2017, a voyaging canoe called Hokulea completed a worldwide voyage using only these techniques. If that seems remarkable, remember the ancient Polynesians, who through close study and kinship with nature were able to forge these paths across an unfathomably vast, vibrant, living ocean. The educator behind this lesson helped TED-Ed's student voice program find its way to Hawaii.
Very cool, you guys. I wish that I had that kind of knowledge to know how to navigate by the clouds. I think that's so cool. Anyway, I think it's also nice to recognize that it wasn't just these Europeans who were the first explorers. The Polynesians were doing it long before them, as were the Chinese. So this man, Leif Erikson, they often say that, like Columbus discovered the America, but Leif Erikson actually got here first, and he actually went onto the American continent. So he was a Viking from Scandinavia. Maybe you have relatives who came from Norway or Sweden or somewhere like that. That's where Leif Erikson came from. And the Vikings were a sea people as well, and they were traveling the whole world exploring in these boats, kind of small boats.
European first set foot in America, and you'll probably get this answer. It was Christopher Columbus in 1492. But this is not correct, for we now know that another great explorer achieved this historic feat some 500 years earlier. That explorer...
And remember that the Polynesians did it thousands of years before that, or hundreds of years.
It was a Viking called Leif Erikson.
We love those Viking hats. Very silly.
This was the age when the Vikings ruled. They were brave, bold, and adventurous, and lived in the countries we now know as Scandinavia. One of them was Leif Erikson, himself the son of another intrepid explorer, Erik the Red. Erik was born on the west coast of Norway. His nickname of Erik the Red probably refers to the color of his hair. He had already spent some years in Iceland, but in the year 982 AD, he led an expedition to a new territory, establishing a settlement there that would last for hundreds of years. Erik the Red called this new land Greenland, He figured that giving it an attractive name would make it seem like a desirable place to live. When Erik had a son, he was called Leif Eriksson, in keeping with the Viking tradition of adding the word son to the father's name. But Leif inherited more than just his father's name. He had adventure and exploration in his blood. Furthermore, his father taught him the necessary skills to be an explorer, leadership and navigation. And so it was that at the age of 25, Leif Eriksson set sail with a crew of 35 men to explore the seas even further to the west, going well beyond Greenland. He was sailing through uncharted waters without maps or a compass. This would be a journey of unrivaled discovery, and one that would take its leader to immortality. Eventually, Eriksson landed in a place he called Vinland, and Vinland was part of what we now call North America. Eriksson's achievement was celebrated for hundreds of years in Norse legends and stories, but many people doubted that it had really happened. Was it true that a Viking could have beaten Columbus by 500 years? Doubts about Eriksson's discovery were finally dispelled in 1960. That was when the modern-day explorers Helge and Anne Ingstad identified a Norse settlement at the northern tip of Newfoundland in what is now Canada. The site at L'Anse aux Meadows has the remains of 9 houses that are unmistakably Nordic in their design. Helge and Anne Ingstad also established that the remains dated back from around 1000 AD, exactly the time that Eriksson's voyage had taken place. And they found artifacts on the site which further proved the truth of Eriksson's story. So Leif Eriksson has now taken his rightful place in world history. In the United States, his achievement is commemorated every year on October 9th, and statues celebrating the great explorer can be found in many American cities. For it does indeed seem to be true. Leif Eriksson, the Viking, was the first European to set foot in America.
So if you name your son Eriksson, then what does he name his son? Eriksson son? Son of Eriksson? All right, so we have Leif Eriksson coming across from Scandinavia. Other European nations were competing against each other for wealth and power. Exploration and colonization became part of their strategy. So they would try to go to other countries. And you can see this is an old map of the world where they didn't really understand even where North and South America were. So this is a 1507 map showing Amerigo Vespucci's realization that the Americas were separate from Asia. Because remember, one thing Christopher Columbus thought is he thought he had sailed around the world and landed here in like India and Asia. But really, he'd only traveled here, and he was on the continent of North and South America. So Amerigo Vespucci realized that this was a separate continent from this one over here. Here's a video about Amerigo Vespucci. We're going to skip that because we have studied his travels already. So then what was going on in the rest of the world? Well, it just so happened that in Europe, one of the things that they really wanted was they wanted spices and other things from Asia that you couldn't find in North America or in Europe. Yeah, who has their hand raised? Lauren, go ahead. I can't hear you, buddy. Do you have yourself unmuted? I see 2 hands raised. Maybe you've got something in chat. Kainoa, did you have a question?
Yeah, can we do book club right now?
2:30. It's in 10 minutes. Sorry.
No, I meant because I have to go at 2:30.
I know, buddy, but that's when Meister Jani gets here and she runs the book club. So book club's at 2:30. It's in 9 more minutes, okay? Sorry. You can tell the other group what you want. Just send them a note, okay? Let me change it to everyone. Oh yeah, it's on everyone. Okay. All right. So Lauren, you should like this. This is all about history. So there was this guy called Marco Polo in Italy, and he went off to China. And at that time, China was very, very powerful. China had a super developed society. They had paper, they had gunpowder, they had silk, they had spices. Other people in Europe didn't have any of that. Even tea we think of as English, but it really came from Asia. And so people would travel along this thing called the Silk Road. I'll show you where that is. So it went right across Europe. Here is Europe up here, and they would go by boat through the Mediterranean and then across this red route to China, overland. That was called the Silk Road, to get the things over there and bring them back to Europe. So this was an overland route that happened before people were exploring really too much by sea. So this was 1,400 years ago. The Silk Road was a big deal. And then the next thing that happened that got people moving around a lot is that the Christian leaders started fighting the Muslim leaders. And there was this huge war between the East and the West in religion. And the Christians, being sweet and wholesome and wonderful, good people, liked to go and kill everybody who didn't believe what they believed. And the same thing with the Muslims, would come over and kill the people that didn't believe what they believed. So that caused a lot of travel back and forth, where people were going and fighting each other over religion. A lovely time in history. And like Vivi said earlier, things started to develop. So metals started to develop, triangular sails, allowing sailors to go more quickly. So this is technology. And in Europe, for whatever reason, the technology improved faster than in other areas. So they started exchanging ideas with Asia. They got the gunpowder from China and started to develop it. They improved map making, and they got science books from Greece. They got printing, magnetic compasses from China, and other instruments that helped them go further from land, and cannons and guns to help them conquer people. So now we're starting to develop new technologies that make one group be able to take over another group. And then there was this that has always occurred in history. In fact, even back in the United States, when we had indigenous people, the practice of taking people as your slaves and forcing them to work for you was going on. But they turned it into sort of a business of buying and selling people, and that hadn't happened before. So the Portuguese were the first Europeans to enslave African people. The slave trade became another motivation for exploration, as it made European business people very wealthy. Some of the exploration crews included enslaved men like Lope Martin, the first man to cross the Pacific to Asia from the Americas and back, and Estevanico, one of the first non-native people to travel through Texas and visit the Mississippi River, who was Muslim from North Africa. Here is a little thing about Christopher Columbus that presents sort of the issues with him.
Christopher Columbus is all over America. There are statues in his honor, streets and cities are named after him. He's got his own national holiday, complete with parades. For centuries, Columbus has been celebrated as the brave explorer who discovered the New World.
We celebrate Columbus Day, the anniversary of that day in 1492, when Columbus first sighted the land of the New World, America.
But Columbus never even set foot on North American soil. His 4 voyages brought him to the modern-day Caribbean islands, Central and South America, but never to the country where more than 50 cities, towns, and counties bear his name. We rarely hear about the other explorers, who actually landed in the US just a couple decades after Columbus. So how did a man who never even set foot in North America end up with a national holiday and a permanent place in American mythology? Columbus and his arrival in the Americas is mostly introduced to kids through books, songs, or cartoons like this one.
I will discover a shortcut to India and bring back some of the great wealth I find there. And I can do it, for I know the world is round.
One of the many problems with cartoons like this one is that it taught a lot of wrong information. Children were told that Columbus defied conventional wisdom and proved the world was round. But at the time, people already knew the Earth was round. Columbus actually claimed the world was smaller than predicted, and he was wrong. Children were also told that Columbus's voyages to the inhabited islands in the Americas were peaceful.
The people Columbus called Indians were very friendly, and they gave Columbus and his men many gifts.
But they don't mention that Columbus and his men were responsible for the mass deaths of native people. A friar who lived on the islands Columbus reached and experienced the brutality of the conquest wrote about it. He wrote, "They forced their way into settlements, slaughtering small children, old men, and pregnant women." These details have been kept out of most textbooks from the beginning, allowing Columbus to become an American icon. The idealized version of Columbus is as old as the United States. It all began during the War of Independence when the US fought the British. The new nation needed a rebellious, non-British symbol, and they found one in Columbus. Once the US won independence, streets and cities were named after him. Columbus's iconic status was further cemented in 1828 when Washington Irving published a biography glorifying him. He described him as brave, heroic, and a genius, but he neglected to mention his brutal treatment of indigenous people. But Columbus's real big break came in the late 1800s when the country he'd never visited started experiencing some massive changes. Italian immigrants were arriving in the United States in big numbers, and they faced harsh discrimination. They were treated as perpetual foreigners and restricted to manual labor. Their Catholic beliefs opened the door for even more discrimination, so they embraced Columbus. After all, he was Italian and Catholic and already admired, so he quickly became an icon for Italian immigrants who argued that they too belonged in America. On the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in 1892, Columbus Day was first brought into the school system. Schools held celebrations and students pledged allegiance to the flag for the first time, associating Columbus with patriotism in classrooms across America. A year later, Columbus became the theme of the World Expo in Chicago, branding him America's hero around the world. As Columbus and his legend became further embedded in American culture, so did the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic social club founded by Italian immigrants. By 1937, the Knights of Columbus had gained enough influence to convince President Roosevelt to proclaim Columbus Day a federal holiday. But not everyone wanted to celebrate Columbus. While the myth of Columbus had been developing throughout history, Native Americans in the US had been dealing with destruction and discrimination for centuries at the hands of all the European settlers that followed Columbus. But in the 60s, things started changing in America. As the civil rights movement demanded change, Native rights became a part of the conversation.
We've asked the government for hundreds of years to do things for our people or with our people. And the government has only compromised, only given us token issues to deal with. We're here today as living factors of the problem that are still existing.
Historians started re-examining Columbus and his story, correcting the myth and including the missing historical facts. As revelations about Columbus have become mainstream, some people have rejected the holiday, as well as the man and the legacy behind it. Today, cities around the US are opting out of celebrating Columbus Day. In some cities, they are choosing to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead. At the same time, more than half of Americans think celebrating Columbus Day is a good idea, according to a poll commissioned by the Knights of Columbus.
And I'm going to have to stop that because I think we're out of time for today and we need to start our book club. But so I didn't get all the way through this slideshow. It's really, really long. We'll finish it tomorrow in class. If you are here.
What lesson is this that we have to say?
It's activity 2 in social studies, and we'll finish it tomorrow, okay? Because we've got book clubs now. And if you were here